As we look forward, we have a debt problem because you can't keep adding to debt faster than you add to income without that problem. And that's a big risk. You have a change of 50, 25 basis points and so on. Let's just go back to the basics and the big picture. First of all, let's take the bond yield. The bond yield, roughly speaking, has got to be about what we determine the expected inflation rate will be over the period of time. Of course, there's a question about that. That number, it probably is settling into the vicinity of 3.5%. That's the right number. There has to be above that a real interest rate. In other words, for those who are holding debt assets, they have to receive a return above the inflation rate by something probably in the vicinity of 1.5%, 2%. So that is going to get you in the vicinity of 4.5%, 5% interest rates. And you're seeing the movement around that level. Then there's the big question of the supply demand for bonds. The government produces a certain amount of bonds that are in line in size that is equivalent of roughly the size of the deficit. That means they're going to have to sell a lot of bonds. And then we look at who are the buyers of those bonds and do they have an adequate appetite? And that's a big risk because many who own those bonds have had losses in that. That's not just banks, that is central banks, that is Japanese investors and so on. And so there's a supply-demand issue. You'll have these wiggles around there, but those are the fundamentals that will drive it. So we're seeing the need for the rise in real interest rates so that the creditor gets an adequate return at the same time as we have a supply-demand balance. So that's how it looks to me. What's happening in the economy is that a lot of money was sent out in the form of checks and the like, and went out to a lot of people. And so the household sector did well because the government sector did poorly. They got themselves in deeper debt intentionally so that the household sector and the business sector could be better off. And then there's the rise in interest rates. What happens from that is that savings of money gradually goes down, and also the debt maturities as they roll forward gradually go up and create a squeeze. So there's an emerging squeeze happening. However, because the unemployment rate is relatively low, and because the compensation levels have been relatively high because of that set of circumstances, the household sector's income has been good. So you have a sector in the household sector, hence the economy as a whole, and I'll include the business sector in that, in which by and large the financial transfer of wealth from the government as it got in debt and gave it to the public sector, gave it to the private sector, that allowed that to happen. That is a formula for a gradually weakening economy, not a big break in the economy, a slowing of that economy. I think that's what we're seeing. And as a result of that, that's what you're seeing in the bond market as there's a bit of a easing within that range. As far as the question of where the rates are, most likely, I think the rate structure is going to be staying at its level, perhaps slightly less, but there's a range of uncertainty around that having to do with the supply-demand question. We're now at a period of time where the supply of bonds to be sold will start hitting the market. And now we have to see the demand issues of that, and that'll be around there. I think that probably, I would say somewhere in the vicinity of relatively flat. I don't think there's going to be any important change in the Fed policy other than maybe a slight easing as the economy slows down. I think the thing to realize is that the economy will likely weaken. In other words, its growth rate going to something close to zero, plus or minus, maybe 1%. And with that exerts a slight downward pressure on interest rates. At the same time, the supply issue becomes an important issue. I think we're talking about the short term as very distinct from the longer term. The short term we just talked about. The longer term is that we are at a point in which we are borrowing money to pay debt service. And there is a process by which when you keep having debt growth faster than income growth, then that means that you have debt service encroaching on your spending. That's the same for the government as it is for us. And as that happens, and you want to keep spending at the same level, there is the need to get more and more into debt. And the way that works, it accelerates. We are at the point of that acceleration, which creates the supply-demand problem. And it's made worse by the other issues that we're talking about. The internal political issue, the internal social conflict issue there is something that is affecting foreign demand for bonds. About 40% of our debt is sold to foreigners. And so there is a concern of the American politics, of the controlling of this debt crisis, and these types of things. So we come back to the same basic question. How strong are we going to be? When we talk about strong, what I mean is also economically strong. And economically strong means financially strong. That means it's just a basic thing. Financially strong means, do you earn more than you spend? Do you have a good income statement as a country? Do we have a good income statement? And do we have a good balance sheet? More assets than we have liabilities. The worse that gets, the more we are going to have that long-term problem. And it's just, you can see it in the numbers. It's just a matter of numbers. We are near that inflection point. That was my biggest moment, okay? Building my little company. This is in 1981, 82. I had calculated that American banks had given a lot more money to lend, a lot more money to Latin American countries than those countries were going to pay back, and that they would have a debt crisis, and that this would send the economy tumbling. That was an extremely controversial point of view. Then it started to happen, and it happened, and Mexico defaulted in August 1982. I thought that there was going to be an economic collapse that was going to follow because there was a series of the other countries. It was just playing out as I had imagined, and that couldn't have been more wrong. That was the exact bottom in the stock market because central banks eased monetary policy, blah, blah, blah. And I couldn't have been more wrong. And I was very publicly wrong and all of that. And I lost money for me and I lost money for my clients. I only had a small company then. These were close people. I had to let them go. I was down to me as the last person. I was so broke I had to borrow $4,000 from my dad to help to pay for my family bills. Very painful. And at the same time, I would say it definitely was one of the best things that ever happened to me, maybe the best thing that happened to me, because it changed my approach to decision making. I kept saying, okay, how do I know whether I'm right? How do I know I'm not wrong? It gave me that. And it didn't give up my audaciousness because I was in a position. What am I going to do? Am I going to go back, put on a tie, go to Wall Street and just do those things? No, I can't bring myself to do that. So I'm at a juncture. How do I deal with my risk and how do I deal with that? And it told me how to deal with my uncertainties. And that taught me, for example, a number of techniques. First, to find the smartest people I could find who disagreed with me and to have quality disagreement. I learned the art of thoughtful disagreement. I learned how to produce diversification. I learned how to do a number of things. That is what led me to create an idea meritocracy. In other words, person by person, I hired them and I wanted the smartest people who would be independent thinkers who would disagree with each other and me well, so that we could be independent thinkers to go off to produce those audacious dreams, because you have to be an independent thinker to do that, and to do that independently of the consensus, independently of each other, and then work ourselves through that, because who knows whether you're going to have the right answer. And by doing that, then that was the key to our success and the things that I want to pass along to people. And that is a magical way of achieving success. If you can create an idea meritocracy, it's so much better in terms of achieving success and also quality relationships with people. But that's what that experience gave me. What's common produces only common results. Okay? Don't
Yes.
judge anything that is good based on whether it's common, because it's only going to give you common results. If you want unique, you have a unique approach. And so that art of thoughtful disagreement is the capacity to hold two things in your mind at the same time. Gee, I think this makes sense, and then saying, I'm not sure it makes sense. Then try to say, why does it make sense? And then to triangulate with others. So if I'm having a discussion like that and I work myself through and I'm not sure, I have to do that in a good way. So I always give attention, for example, let's start off, what does the other person know relative to what I know? If a person has a higher expertise or things, I'm much more inclined to ask questions. I'm always asking questions. If you want to learn, you're asking questions, you're not arguing. Okay? You're taking in, you're assessing when it comes into you. Does that make sense? Are you learning something? Are you getting epiphanies and so on? And I try to then do that. If the conversation, as we're trying to decide what is true, and we're trying to do that together, and we see truth different, then I might even call in another really smart, capable person and try to say, what is true and how do we explore that together? And you go through that same thing, having open-mindedness and assertiveness at the same time.
Do you think credit is good or bad for society? That system that's so fundamentally based on credit.
I think credit is great, even though people often overdo it. Credit is that somebody has earned money, and what happens is they lend it to somebody else who's got better ideas, and they cut a deal, and then that person with the better ideas is going to pay it back. And if it works well, it helps resource allocations go well, providing people like the entrepreneurs and all of those, they need capital. They don't have capital themselves, and so somebody's going to give them capital, and they'll give them credit along those lines. Then what happens is it's not managed well in a variety of ways. So you always have it overdone. in always the same way. Everything, by the way, almost everything happens over and over again for the same reasons. So these debt crises all happen over and over again for the same reasons. They get it overdone, and then you go through the process of making the adjustments according that. If you didn't have credit, then everybody'd sort of be stuck. Credit is a good thing, but it can easily be overdone. So now we get into what is money? What is credit?
Yeah.
Okay, you get into money and credit. So if you're holding credit and you think that's worthwhile, keep in mind that the central bank, let's say, it can print the money. What is that promise? You have an IOU, and the IOU says you're going to get a certain number of dollars, let's say, or yen or euros. And that is what the IOU is. And so the question is, will you get that money, and what will it be worth? And then also you have a government, which is a participant in that process, because they are on the hook, they owe money. And then will they print the money to make it easy for everybody to pay? So you have to pay attention to those two. But my conclusion is, and it comes across pretty clearly, that of course you want it. And even if you understand it and the cycles well, you can benefit from those cycles rather than to be hurt by those cycles. Because the way the cycle works is somebody gets over indebted, they have to sell an asset. Okay, that's when assets become cheaper. How do you acquire the asset? It's a whole process.
What is money? It's history and future. How do you think about money?
There are two things that money is for. It's a medium of exchange, and it's a storehold of wealth. So you could say something's a medium of exchange, and then you could say, is it a storehold of wealth? Okay. And money is that vehicle that is those things and can be used to pay off your debt. So when you have a debt and you provide it, it pays off your debt. That's that process.
It only can be a medium of exchange or a store of wealth when everybody recognizes it to be of value.
That's right. And so you see in the history around the world, and you go to places. I was in an island in the Pacific in which they had as money these big stones. And literally, they were taking a boat, this big carved stone, and they were taking it from one of the islands to the other, and it sank, the piece of this big stone, piece of money that they had, and it went to the bottom, and they still perceived it as having value, even though it was in the bottom and it's this big hunk of rock. The fact that somebody owned it, they would say, oh, I'll own it for this and that. I've seen beads in different places, shells converted to this in mediums of exchange. And when we look at what we've got, it is the notion that if I give it to you, I can then take it and I can buy something with it. And so it's a matter of perception. Okay. And then we go through the history of money and the vulnerabilities of money. And what we have is, through history, there's been two types of money. Those that are claims on something of value, like the connection to gold or something. Or they just are money without any connection. And then we have a system now, which is a fiat monetary system. So that's what money is. Then it will last as long as it's kept of value, and it works that way. Let's say central banks, when they get in the position of like they owe a lot of money, like we have, it's increasingly the case, and they also are a bind, and they have the printing press to print the money and get out of that, and you have a lot of people might be in that position, then you can print it and then it could be devalued in there. And so history has shown, forget about today, that every currency has either ended as being a currency or devalued as a currency over long periods of time. So it evolves and it changes, but everybody needs that medium of exchange and everybody needs that storehold of wealth. So it keeps changing what is money over a period of time. The problem with Bitcoin is that it's not an effective medium of exchange. Like, it's not easy for me to go in there and buy things with it. And then it's not an effective storehold of value because it has a volatility that's based on speculation and the like. So it's not a very effective saving medium of exchange and storehold of wealth. So in my opinion, some digital currencies are likely to succeed more or less based on that ability to do it. Then the question is, what happens? Do central banks allow that to happen? I really do believe it's possible to get a better form of money that central banks don't control, a better force of money that the central banks don't control. But then that's not yet happened. And so they've got to go through that evolutionary process. In order to go through that evolutionary process, first of all, governments have got to allow that to happen, which is to some extent a threat to them in terms of their power. And that's an issue. And then you have to also build the confidence in all of the components of it to say, okay, that's going to be effective because I won't have problems owning it. So I think that digital currencies have some element of potential, but there's a lot of hurdles that are going to have to be gotten over. I think that it'll be a very long time possibly never, but anyway, a very long time before we have that, let's say, get into a position that would be effective means relative to gold, let's say, if you were to think of that, because gold has a track record, of thousands of years,
Right.
All across countries.
Yeah.
It has its mobility. It has the ability to put it down. It has certain abilities. It's got disadvantages relative to digital currencies, but central banks will hold it. Like there's central banks that worry. Other countries' central banks might worry about whether the US dollar is going to print. And so the thing they're going to go to is not going to be the digital currency. The thing they're going to go to is gold or something else, some other currency. They got to pick it. And so I think it's a long way to go.
But you think it's possible that one day we don't even have a central bank because of a currency that cannot be controlled by the central bank is the primary currency?
It would be very remote possibility or very long in the future.
Got it.
My area of expertise is economics and markets, so I get down to like a real nitty-gritty. I can't tell you whether the plane is going to fall out of the sky because of its particular fundamentals. I don't know enough about that, but it happens over and over again and so on. It gives me faith, okay? So without me knowing that. In the markets and the economy, I know those things well enough, in a sense, to say that by and large, that structure is right. What we're seeing is right. Now, whether there are disruptions and it has effects that can come, not because that structure is right, I believe it's right, but whether it can be hurt by, let's say, connectivity or journal entries. They could take all the money away from you through your digital entries. There's all sorts of things that can happen in various ways that means that that money is worthless or the system falls. But from what I see in terms of its basic structure and those complexities that still take my breath away, I would say knowing enough about the mechanics of them, that doesn't worry me.
Have you seen disruptions in your lifetime that really surprised you?
All the time. This is one of the great lessons of my life, is that many times I've seen things that I was very surprised about, and that I realized almost all of those I was surprised about because they were just the first time it happened to me. They didn't happen in my lifetime before. But when I researched them, they happened in other places or other people's lifetimes. So, for example, I remember 1971, the dollar, there was no such thing as a devaluation of a currency. It didn't experience it. And the dollar was connected to gold, and I was watching events happen, and then you get on, and that definition of money all of a sudden went out the window because it was not tied to gold, and then you have this devaluation, or the first oil shock, or the second oil shock, or so many of these things. But almost always, I realized when I looked in history, they happened before. They just happened in other people's lifetimes, which led me to realize that I needed to study history and what happened in other people's lifetimes and what happened in other countries and places so that I would have timeless and universal principles for dealing with that thing, the implausible happening. It's like a 1 in 100-year storm. Let me give you a rule. If the future can be different from the past, and you don't have deep understanding, you should not rely on AI. The cause-effect relationships that are leading you to place that bet in anything important. Let's say if it was do surgeries, and you would say, how do I do surgeries? I think it's totally fine to watch all the doctors do the surgeries. You can put it on, take a digital camera and do that, convert that into AI algorithms that go to robots and have them do surgeries, and I'd be comfortable with that. Because if it keeps doing the same thing over and over again and you have enough of that, that would be fine, even though you may not understand the algorithms. The future would be the same. Yes. That appendicitis or whatever it is will be handled the same way the surgery, that's fine. However, what happens with AI is, for the most part, is it takes a lot of data with a high enough sample size, and then it puts together its own algorithms. Okay, there are two ways you can come up with algorithms. You can either take your thinking and express them in algorithms, or you can put the data in and say, what is the algorithm? That's machine learning. And when you have machine learning, it'll give you equations which quite often are not understandable. If you would try to say, okay, now describe what it's telling you, it's very difficult to describe, and so they can escape understanding. And so it's very good for doing those things that could be done over and over again if you're watching and you're not taking that. But if the future is different from the past and you don't have deep understanding, you're going to get in trouble. That's the main thing.
You're, if I may say so, one of the richest people in the world. So you're a good person to ask. Does money buy happiness?
No, it's been shown that once you get over a basic level of income so that you can take care of the pain, you can health and whatever, there's no correlation between the level of happiness that one has and the level of money that one has. That thing that has the highest correlation is quality relationships with others, community. If you look at surveys of these things across all surveys and all societies, it's a sense of community and interpersonal relationships. That is not in any way correlated with money. You can go down to native tribes in, very poor places, or you can go in all different communities. And so they have the opportunity to have that. I'm very lucky in that I started with nothing, so I have the full range. I can tell you, by not having money and then having quite a lot of money, I did that in the right order. But I had all really that I needed because I had two parents who loved me and took good care of me, and I went to a public school that was a good public school. You don't need much more than that in order to, that's the equal opportunity part. Anyway, what I'm saying is I experienced the range, and there are many studies on the answer to your question. No, money does not bring happiness. Money gives you an ability to make choices at the most fundamental level. It doesn't take a whole lot, but it takes enough. You can take care of yourself and your family to be able to learn, do the basics, have the relationships, have health care, the basics of those types of things. You can cover the patients. And then to have maybe enough security, but maybe not too much security, that you essentially are okay. That's really good. That's what money will get you.
And everything else could go either way.
There's more. Then beyond that, what it then starts to do, that's the most important thing. But beyond that is to help to make your dreams happen in various ways. Those dreams might not be just my own dreams, their impact on others' dreams. I could tell you that people who are very wealthy, who have that, feel that they don't have enough money. Bill Gates will feel almost broke because relative to the things he'd like to accomplish, oh my God, he doesn't have enough money to accomplish the things he wishes for. But those things, they're not the most fundamental things. So I think that people sometimes think money has value. Money doesn't have value. Money is just a medium of exchange at a store of the wealth. And so what you have to say is, what is it that you're going to buy? Now, there are other people who get their gratification in ways that are different from me, but I think in many cases, let's say somebody who used money to have a status symbol, that's probably unhealthy. But then, I don't know, somebody who says, I love a great, gorgeous painting, and it's going to cost lots of money. In my priorities, I can't get there. But that doesn't mean, who am I to judge others in terms of, let's say, their element of the freedom to do those things? So it's a little bit complicated. But by and large, that's my view on money and wealth. I have a principle that I believe in is make your work and your passion the same thing. In other words, if you can make your work and your passion, it's just going to work out great. And then, of course, people have different purposes of work. And I don't want to be theoretical about that. People have to take care of their family. So money at a certain point is an important component of that work. So you look beyond that. What is the money going to get you and what are you trying to achieve? But the most important thing, I agree, is meaningful work and meaningful relationships. Like if you can get into the thing that your mission that you're on and you are excited about that mission that you're on. And then you can do that with people who you have the meaningful relationships with. You have meaningful work and meaningful relationships. I mean, that is fabulous for most people. It's interesting, as you get later in life, the levels of happiness rise, and the highest level of happiness is between ages 70 and 80, which is interesting for other reasons. But in that spot, and the key to work-life balance is to realize and to learn how to get more out of an hour of work. What people are thinking is that they have to make a choice between one thing and another, and of course they do, but they don't realize that if they develop the skill to get a lot more out of an hour, it's the equivalent of having many more hours in your life. That allows you to get more life into your life, and it reduces the work-life balance. Early in one's life tends to be a very happy period all the way up, and 16 is like a really great happy. You start to get elements of freedom, you get your driver's license or whatever, but 16 is there. Junior year in high school quite often can be a stressful period to try to get things about the high school. You go into college, tends to be very high happiness, generally speaking.
Freedom,
yeah, friendships, all of that. Freedom is a big thing. And then 23 is a peak point kind of in happiness, that freedom. Then sequentially, one has a great time, they date, they go out and so on. You find the love of your life. You begin to develop a family. And then with that, as time happens, you have more of your work-life balance challenges that come and your responsibilities. And then as you get there in that mid part of your life, that is the biggest struggle. Chances are you will crash in that period of time. You'll have your series of failures. That's when you go into the abyss. You learn, you hopefully learn from those mistakes. You have a metamorphosis. You come out, you change, you hopefully become better, and you take more responsibilities and so on. And then when you get to the later part, as you are starting to approach the transition, before you go into the third phase of your life, second phase is you're working and trying to be successful. Third phase of your life is you want people to be successful without you. You want your kids to be successful without you, because when you're at that phase, they're at making their transition from the first phase to the second phase, and they're trying to be successful, and you want them to be successful without you. And your parents are gone, and then you have freedom. You have freedom again. And that with that freedom, and then you have these, history has shown with this, you have friendships, you have perspective on life, you have different things. And that's one of the reasons that that later part of the life can be real, on average, actually, it's the highest. Very interesting thing. There are surveys, how good do you look and how good do you feel? That's the highest survey. Now, they're not looking the best, and they're not feeling the best, right? Maybe it's 35 that they're actually looking the best and feeling the best. But they rank the highest at that point, survey results of being the highest.
That's so fascinating.
In that 70 to 80 period of time, because it has to do with an attitude on life. Then you start to have grandkids. Oh, grandkids are great. And you start to experience that transition well. That's what the arc of life pretty much looks like. And I'm experiencing it. I think that evolution is the greatest force in the universe, and that we're all tiny bits of an evolutionary type of process where it's just matter and machines that go through time, and that we all have a deeply embedded inclination to evolve and contribute to evolution. So I think it's to personally evolve and contribute to evolution.
Finally, closing words of advice from Ray Dalio. Pain plus reflection equals progress.